This is a kind of weird story. And it's weird not just because of the glowing people and the fact that two ghosts disappeared. Neither of them actually died according to scriptures, but these two ghosts show up and they're also glowing. All of that creates a very weird spectacle and a very odd scene if you can try and imagine that or picture it. But as I sat with this story, as I was preparing what I wanted to say to you, what I felt God was leading me to say, I felt convicted and just drawn to Peter's reaction. Not the glowing people, because that is amazing, but Peter's reaction, how he responds to that, how he responds to what he sees in front of him. And to me, it's very odd, because Jesus, the Messiah, foretold in the Old Testament, and Moses and Elijah, representatives of the foundation of the Jewish faith, are now standing before Peter, James, and John. And Peter's first reaction to this is to build dwelling places for them. That is not how I would respond to this scene. Like, put yourself there. Imagine that, you wake up or you open your eyes and there these people are standing in front of you. And what is your first reaction? It's probably to ask the question, what is going on? What am I looking at? What am I experiencing? What is taking place right in front of me? It's not, hey, it's good that I'm here. Let me build some tents for you to hang out in. And that incongruency, that question, then led me to ask my first question of just why, Peter? Where is this coming from? What is happening? And the conclusion that I came to after I sat with this for a while is that Peter is afraid. But I'll expand on that in a moment. I want to talk about Peter for a moment, because Peter to me is a very interesting guy. Peter, like all the disciples, gave up everything to follow Jesus. His way of life, his family, his friends, everything to become devoted to this man, Jesus. And just a week earlier, for the months, maybe years up to this point that he had spent with Jesus, he had finally come to the conclusion that Jesus was who he had been looking for all his life. Jesus was the Messiah. This happened 1 week earlier than this moment on the mountain. It happened in chapter 16, just verses before this. Jesus asked the disciples, "Who do the people say that I am? And who do you say that I am?" And Peter's the only one who says to Jesus, "You are the Messiah. You are the one." And Jesus proceeds to tell him what was going to happen. That he was going to go to Jerusalem and he was going to be arrested and he was going to be tortured and killed at the hands of the powers that be. And Peter, in response to that, also has a fairly unexpected reaction. Peter then proceeds to tell Jesus that his plan of suffering and death are silly and stupid and he's not going to let him do them. That's Peter's response. And in response, Jesus gives Peter arguably the most harsh scolding he gives anyone in all of the Gospels. And he says in Matthew 16:23, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are a hindrance to me. You are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." And Jesus was right. Obviously. Peter's mind was not focused on the things of God. He did not have the perspective of God's kingdom. But we'll come back to that. And so in this scene up on the mountain with these three glowing people, what does Peter do? Peter offers to build these dwellings. And my question, my curiosity, because this is the way my mind thinks, I want to understand why Peter wanted to do that. What provoked such an odd response? Where did that come from? And on the surface, it's very easy to say it was just pure excitement. Like Peter, and I say this also, sidetrack, Mark and Luke paint a very different picture of Peter. Mark and Luke paint Peter as not knowing how he's responding. But Matthew wants us to see something different in Peter, I believe. Matthew doesn't describe Peter the way the others do. And so on the surface, we see that there's this excitement for Peter, who has now acknowledged that Jesus is the Messiah, the one that they've been waiting for all this time. He's excited. Peter's excited. He wants this. He wants this. He wants to see it happen. Jesus was the dreams. provoking the spiritual revival and rallying the people. And for some of the people of Israel, they were beginning to wonder if finally the kingdom of Israel was going to be reestablished, if it was going to be recreated as in the days of old when David was king, when they were a force to be reckoned with in the world. And Peter wants front row seats to this. He wants to be a part of that. He wants to see this happen. And more than that, I think Peter wants to make this happen. I think Peter fixates on this vision that he has for the kingdom of God, for Peter's kingdom of God. And so just below this excitement, we see another motivating factor. We see something else. If we peel back the layer of the onion, we find something more, and that's control. Peter is trying to assert his control over the events taking place around him. He knew very clearly what Jesus said. He knew that Jesus had to die, and there was nothing he could do to stand in the way of that. But Peter wasn't done. Peter still wanted to see this happen. He wanted to establish, or maybe formalize, this religion that was birthing in front of him. He wanted to formalize Jesus as the ruler, as the king of Israel, as others had tried to do throughout Jesus' life and ministry. And he wanted to control that. And we know that would never work. Like we, from our perspective, 2,000 years later, know that would never have worked. Jesus never had the intention of kicking out the Romans and establishing this, new theocracy in Israel that would lead the way for the world. That was not Jesus' intention. That was not God's plan. That was nowhere on the agenda. So why this desire for control in Peter? Where was that coming from? Because we all have that tendency. But I think there's another layer there. And it's the layer that I really want us to focus on. It's the layer I mentioned a moment ago. It's the fact that Peter was afraid. Fear, I believe, was his motivation deep down. Because ultimately, and this is true of just life in general, ultimately all attempts to control others and the world around us are actions that arise from deep places within us, deep places of fear, that we try to manipulate and force our agenda in the world so that those things, those fears never come to pass. Those are not things that we ever have to experience. Having control helps us to avoid those fears becoming real. And so for some of us, control looks like avoiding the fear of being taken advantage of, where we now say, in an effort to control, I won't let their will dominate mine. I won't lose what I have worked so hard to accomplish. Or maybe we fear being abandoned. And so we control with the effort to say, I won't be left behind. I won't be abandoned. I won't be left out in the cold. Some of us fear failure. And so we say, I won't let another mistake define me. I won't make another mistake. And we obsess over that. And we won't let other people down who are relying on us and trusting in us. We won't fail. Or maybe we fear pain. We fear suffering. We fear that for our loved ones. And so we say, I won't let someone else experience that. I won't let the people I care about have to endure that. And so what was Peter's fear? What was going on for Peter? What was controlling and driving him? I believe Peter feared losing Jesus. And I believe he feared losing the future that Jesus represented. And on the most basic level, he feared losing his friend. He'd spent all his time with him. He loved this man. And he feared losing this future. When your hopes, your dreams, your expectations, everything is wrapped up in what is just around the corner. You can see it, you can almost taste it. Peter didn't want to let that go. And yet what we just experienced in chapter 16 was exactly what was happening. It was starting to slip away from him. Jesus said, I will go and I will die, and you can't change that. See, Peter's fear, I believe, In whatever one of those forms it might take, I believe that is universal to the human experience. There are things that can happen in each one of our lives that make us fear losing hold of our lives. And for some of us, we want to know what tomorrow will bring, and we want to know what the day after tomorrow will bring. And we want it to be good. And when we feel like it's not, we stress. Anxiety takes over. We lash out. We do all kinds of things to see that happens. And for some of us, we don't want to feel like what we earned or what we worked for or what we deserve is being taken from us. And for some of us, there are things that can happen us that make us fear losing the future that we expected and were counting on. For anyone who's ever experienced financial crisis, a divorce, the loss of a loved one, the loss of a relationship, a big part to grief. And I've experienced this so much in my own life. A big part to grieving and processing those experiences isn't just the present reality of our life that's now in chaos with that. We also no longer have the future that we were looking forward to. When we lose those things, we now have to process and grieve a future that is now no longer real. And sometimes we then panic. And we react with coping mechanisms. We hold tighter to our finances and become intensely, even obsessively focused on having enough. We hold tighter to those around us by renewing emphasis on personal relationships. Or maybe, like is true of me, like has been true of me in the past. I'm working on this. I am. We wall up our hearts and become cold and stoic, choosing to no longer let anyone or anything come close to causing us that pain again. And so I see Peter and his attempt to build these tents as a coping mechanism to deal with his fear of losing Christ, of losing that future. But what happens when that's taken away? What happens when that cloud comes down and they realize that there is no controlling what God is doing? There is no manipulating the divine Lord of the universe. What happens when they realize that it's no longer in their power or abilities? They fall down. There's nothing else to do but fall down before the God of the universe as he says, "Listen to my son whom I love." There's no other way to react. When we face our mortality, our humanity, our smallness, and the fact that we can't control our destiny and the destiny of the world around us, we fall down either from humility of letting go or from exhaustion of realizing I just can't anymore. The disciples with Jesus on that mountain realized that there is no manipulating God, and that is exactly what happened. They accepted their smallness. They were overwhelmed by it even. And how does God respond to that? To me, that's one of the coolest parts of this whole passage is how God responds to that. Unlike chapter 16, there's no correction. They don't get reprimanded. There's no harsh, words from Jesus about just like, "You screwed it up again, Peter. This isn't about the tents. There's other things going on. How do you not see this yet?" When they fall down, there's none of that. Instead, God meets them with compassion and an invitation exactly where they are. He says, "Listen to them." And they find comfort from a hand on their shoulder. In verse 7, Jesus touches them and says, "Rise and have no fear." Rise and have no fear. So here's the beauty of this strange event that took place almost 2,000 years ago on a mountain witnessed only by a select few. It very much is our story too. Like Peter, when we reach that point where when we realize the depths of our own limitation, our smallness, our futility of trying to control and manipulate the world and those around us, it brings us to our knees. Like Peter, when we reach that point that we stop striving and fighting and obsessing over the world and thinking that salvation is going to come from our own efforts, or maybe someone else's, or maybe even the government's, when we get to that point, we find in our peaceful humility and trust, because hopefully that's where we get to, or if we haven't gotten to that point of peaceful humility and trust, as I so often don't, in our anxious terror, Christ meets us with a hand on the shoulder and the simple word, arise and do not be afraid. Those are Christ's words for us today. But this sermon doesn't change reality for us. What exists outside of this room that you brought into this room is still waiting for us. It's still back at our houses. It's still out there in the world. The world is dangerous. The world is complicated. And there are things that we have to try and work through together. But before we can get to that point, we have to acknowledge and let go of our fear. To be willing to face our smallness. But to do that together, to do that as a community, to do that says there is always still hope. It's just not found in my striving. In C.S. Lewis's book, The Silver Chair, Aslan says these final words to his friends. He says, "Here on the mountain, I have spoken to you clearly. I will not often do so down in Narnia. Here on the mountain, the air is clear, and your mind is clear. As you drop down into Narnia, the air will thicken. Take great care that it does not confuse your mind. And the signs which you have learned here will not look at all as you expect them to look when you meet them there. That is why it is so important to know them by heart and pay no attention to appearance. Remember the signs and believe the signs. Nothing else matters." Just as Aslan does for his friends up on that mountain in that book, which is a great book, by the way, I want to offer you a different reality while we remain on this mountain together. One that I hope you can carry with. One where our focus is solely on following and obeying Christ, as the voice in the cloud told the disciples and tells us today still. In this reality, our lives are being used to bring peace to conflict. Our lives in Christ are manifestations of a love unknown and foreign to this world. In this reality, our lives rest in the assurance that Christ's life, death, and resurrection have secured a future that gives us hope, and it's a future that is breaking into this world, even though darkness lingers on. We are given the opportunity to bear witness to Christ's victory on the cross and in the empty tomb by offering our time, our energy, our resources to loving and caring for others, regardless of color, nationality, creed, or social status, because in God's kingdom, those categories do not exist. That is why Faith Church is so active in missions, because we believe we are doing just that. This is the reality I want to invite each and every one of you into this morning. This is the reality that, like Aslan, I hope does not get lost in the thick air that meets us outside these doors and off this mountain. This is what I want to invite you into. This is what Christ invited Peter and the disciples into. So as Christ said to the disciples when they found themselves humbled in a confusing and overwhelming world, out of their control, I say to you now, arise and do not be afraid. Because Christ has told us, behold, I am with you always, even to the very end of the age. Amen.